On the final stop of his five-nation African tour, President Bush promised to help make Liberia a symbol of liberty for Africa and the world. After a 14-year civil war that nearly devastated the nation, Bush praised the country's ability to rebuild and President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's efforts to improve education and battle disease. The BBC's Laura Trevelyan accompanied the president throughout his trip. She sent us this final report before his departure for home.
For a president whose foreign policy has been defined by military action in Afghanistan and Iraq, the tight focus of this trip has been on his humanitarian legacy, combating AIDS and malaria. By going to Rwanda, George Bush was able to underscore what the US is doing in Darfur, a conflict he calls a genocide. America's been criticized for wringing its hands over the killings in the west of Sudan, while being unwilling to send in troops. The carefully chosen countries on this visit were all relative success stories in Africa, but there was no escaping the tribal violence in Kenya. George Bush dispatched his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, there on Monday to support the peace efforts of Kofi Annan. White House officials faced questions about why the president was on a goodwill tour of Africa against a backdrop of turbulence in Kenya. In Ghana, one of the most stable countries on the continent, George Bush had to confront worries about AFRICOM, the plan for a US military command on the continent. It's seen as giving the US a military foothold in Africa from which to protect its strategic interests. In Liberia, on the last day of his visit, he was delivering a message of support. Interestingly, the Chinese leader Hu Jintao was here a year earlier. He too gave money to help Liberia tackle malaria. Liberia is rich in diamonds and timber, and it's keen to trade.
ISIS in Kenya continues, and its impact ripples throughout the continent. One major effect is on the supply of much-needed international food aid, much of which flows into a port in Kenya, then through neighbouring Uganda and onward. Millions of people depend on that route for a steady supply of goods. Rachel Harvey has been to Uganda to look at the disruption and the potential long-term fallout.
On the move. The Kenya-Uganda border crossing is one of the busiest on the African continent. The gateway to a vast hinterland. Goods destined not just for Uganda, but also further afield. Southern Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, funneled through this point. But in the immediate aftermath of the political crisis in Kenya, the flow of traffic was disrupted. Trucks burned, cargo stolen. At a local bar on the Ugandan side of the border, drivers trade stories about the dangers of the road. Things are better than they were, but Kukuru, who runs a haulage firm, is still reluctant to take the risk.
We fear to push the trucks up to Mombasa these days. There are some which are still stuck there because we don't know exactly whether the road is free or it is still disturbing.
We haven't driven across, we've just driven. Others have continued making regular trips in and out of Kenya, but it takes much longer than it used to.
You must have a convoy of security, these armed forces, because any time you don't know what's in front of you.
But at least some trucks are moving again, which is welcome news for Ugandan traders. Many businesses have been hard hit. Containers of goods looted or lost on the road from Mombasa means less to sell in Kampala.
This is a demand-driven economy. It's a pure, perfect competition. The forces of demand and supply will dictate the prices. So the moment the supply is low, automatically the demand is high and the prices will shoot up. So everybody in Uganda has suffered as a result of the Kenya crisis.
No forklift trucks and very few shoes. It's not just commercial trade that's been affected by what's happened in Kenya. One of the world's biggest humanitarian aid operations is at stake too. Much of the food moving through this warehouse comes by road from Mombasa. Each one of these sacks of maize weighs 50 kilos. And 7 million people in East Africa depend on this feed, which might explain the sense of urgency.
Prior to the crisis, we used to move about 1,000 metric tons, or about 35 trucks, out of Mombasa port for our onward operations each day. Since the crisis, we dropped down to about 300 metric tons per day.
The WFP is now considering alternatives to the Mombasa route, and one idea is to make more use of this place, Port Bell, just outside Kampala, bringing supplies up through Tanzania and across Lake Victoria. And it looks as if Kampala is a bit of a transit hub, really, for the rest of the region.
Well, it is. It's one of our main hubs in East Africa, and from Kampala, our commodities move on to through Uganda into South Sudan. We also cover areas in eastern DRC, down in Rwanda and in Burundi.
A small amount of cargo already moves through here, but there's only one working ferry, and it only gets here every 2 days. These rusting hulks haven't moved since 2005. It's hard to imagine Port Bell handling a lot more cargo without a major upgrade. But why hasn't that already happened long before now?
We have an East African transport master plan, but it isn't easy always to marshal resources when you are many. And so we have had to do it ourselves. And where we can with our partner states, we are still in the process of mobilizing funding for that investment.
The Kenyan crisis has exposed Uganda's vulnerability as a landlocked country. Changing that will take political as well as financial investment. Until or unless that happens, millions of people across the region will continue to depend on the road from Mombasa. And that means depending too on a return to stability in Kenya. Rachel Harvey, BBC News, Uganda.